Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 236. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Mark Mustian about his new Southern Gothic novel, Boy with Wings. In this work of historical fiction, a boy named Johnny Cruel is born with wing-like appendages on his back. Is he a miracle, or is he cursed? Johnny ends up in a freak show traveling through the South in the 1930s. While he bears his back for the entertainment of onlookers, he finds that the very thing that shocks people also gives him power. Mark had long wanted to write a book about odd people, and he knew he finally had something special when he struck upon the idea of Johnny Cruel, the boy with wings. In this story, Mark delves into the idea of what it's like to be different, as well as issues of race and religion in the South during the 1930s. In this episode, I'll chat with Mark about his writing journey, society's long-standing fascination with weirdness, and why he says his books are the product of an early midlife crisis, as well as a few other things coming up. Mark Mustian, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks, Stacey. Glad to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, Boy with Wings. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, I thought about writing a book about odd people, for want of a better term, for a long time. And I had mentioned this to my agent at the time, and he had said, "Oh, have you ever read this book, Geek Love, by Catherine Dunn?" And I had not. And so I read it and I was like, wow, this is really something here. And so it made me sort of rethink, how do I want to do this? What do I want to do? And so I ended up with the Boy with Wings is about a boy with these strange things on his back that ends up in a freak show traveling the United States in the 1930s. And it's to some degree, it's about religion, it's about race, but more than anything, it's about what it's like and what it means to be different. And he's stared at, he's put on stage. And so I tried to sort of reach that point that, I think everybody's felt at some point that what it's like being on the outside looking in.
What was the spark for you, that thing that really made you think, okay, here's the story. This is what I'm going to write around, or the trigger, do you think?
Well, I had the idea about, sort of the Boy with Wings. I had 3 novels published, and they've all, to some degree, had a religious element to them. And so I thought about this, about, what would happen? What would people think about, this? What would they assume this is an angel? This is a devil? And that sort of got me going on it. And then I did a lot of research about sideshows, freak shows, so-called freaks, who are oddities of nature, and sort of how they've been treated through history. And it's waxes and wanes between people idolizing them or scorning them or using them in some capacity. And so that kind of got me going on it.
Well, let's talk about your main character, Johnny. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about him. What should readers know? What should they expect?
Well, at the beginning of the book, Johnny is 6, 7 years old, and the book starts with him being buried alive, and he is because of the neighbors and people in this rural community have heard about him and seen him, and people get sick, and they're blaming him that he's some devil child or something, and so his mother concocts, with some other circus people, this sort of fake death where they're going to, pretend he's died, and then they can sort of get away from all this. And so the book starts from his point of view, waking up, in this box in the dark. And that's, and it gets a little lighter from there, but that's sort of, the book starts with him and his, sort of this sense of waking up and not really knowing where he is and not being able to move or get out.
What was it like writing this character? I imagine there was an emotional toll to write a character, one a young man, a young boy in in this situation, but for everything that he would have to go through in the book. I'm curious how the book affected you. How did writing this character affect you? Do you still carry him with you?
Well, yeah, and it goes back to a little what I was saying before that I tried to touch the place that everybody I think has experienced at some point in their lives of being different, of being on the outside looking in. And so, and it makes you think about the times in your life when it made me think about times in my life when I've been on the outside. And for me, it was probably in middle school, where I was not cool, as the phrase then and maybe still now. And I just remember what it felt like. So part of it is that is touching that. The other part is I wanted to sort of think from this kid's perspective, right? So he ends up in this show. He's exposing his back to the world, and suddenly he's a star. And so I tried to get the feel for, all right, well, maybe this is, hey, this is not, compared to where I've been, this is not that bad. And it was interesting. I'm doing some appearances in connection with the book with a current sideshow performer who has some physical, abnormalities, if you will. And I asked him, so, well, what is it like for you to go on stage? And he says, I love it. Said, it's great. That's the best part of my life, really. And so it's interesting, sort of that juxtaposition of being, on the outside looking in, and then suddenly you're the star.
Right, right. Well, let's talk about the setting because there's sort of three components to it. Time, so the era in which you've set the book. Location, I guess a large part of this takes place in the South.
Right.
And then the setting of the freak show. So let's maybe take each of those in turn because they sort of all converge to make this perfect storm for your book. So let's talk about the era, the 1930s, and how that affects the characters and their journey.
Well, yeah. So the book starts in the late 1920s in North Florida, and part of Johnny, and again without giving too much away of the book, Johnny sort of lands in a turpentine camp with mostly really all African American people are there. And he's not had any exposure to Black people, and he is sort of taken in by them because he's lost his mother by this point, and so has several years of sort of again feeling like being on the outside, and then suddenly feeling as part of things. And then he's taken away by a white overseer, sees him there, says, "What are you doing? What's going on here with this?" And so, the 1930s, I mean, clearly is from a racial standpoint. And if you know anything about turpentine camps and what this was like, I mean, this is sort of one step above, maybe a half step above indentured servitude. I mean, you're working for the company, you've got to buy the script to use in their store. You can never get out of debt. And so that was, part of the racial and other, just part of the 1930s, and it extended past that. The freak shows, and it's interesting, sideshows in general probably hit their heyday in the earlier part of the 20th century, right after the turn of the century. And the whole, P.T. Barnum thing and stuff, it started the end of the 1800s and then sort of moved into the early 1900s. And by the 30s, I wanted to capture what I felt like was sort of, things were starting to unravel a little bit here. That these aren't as big a deal as they used to be. It's the depression. People are poor. They don't have enough money to go to things. And so it was a feeling of, hey, we've sort of hit the tail end of this and things are headed downhill a little bit. And just what it's like to, to sort of, these guys, most circuses at the beginning of the century, went on trains. I mean, that's how they moved around, the Ringling Brothers and all that. And this was, I wanted to get sort of a second or third tier. These guys went in trucks, and it could get them into further rural areas that just never saw, a circus never made it that far. And so here are these human oddities that were drawing attention, and that's sort of how they made it work.
And what was it about the South, setting it where you did for the most part? What was it about, let's say, that area of the country that made it a good setting for the story?
Well, I guess for one, I'm very familiar with it. I've lived in the South my whole life, and so in terms of how people speak, what they think, how they react to things, and even in this term, in some respects, we haven't moved that far from the 1930s, and so I wanted to sort of highlight, that, and the fact that again, if you're a Southerner and you're a Southern writer, I mean, race is a factor. I mean, I don't know how it's really hard for me not to write about that, as is religion. I mean, this is, there's a reason it's called the Bible Belt. I mean, it's a huge, big factor living here. So that all wrapped into it as well.
Yeah. Well, I guess the category for this book, if you were to find it on a bookshelf, would probably be under Southern Gothic, I would imagine. Can you explain?
That's been a topic of much debate, actually, with the
Really?
publisher and me and booksellers, because it sort of fits in, it could fit in several different categories. The actual
Mm-hmm.
on the spine of the book, which we had much discussion about, it's historical fiction / fantasy.
Oh, okay.
But I would say Southern Gothic, there's a religious element to this, and so it could fit sort of in several different categories. But yeah, but Southern Gothic is certainly sort of how I view it.
Yeah. What what are the parameters? What is your understanding of that term, Southern Gothic? Because I mean, if it's thrown around for books that are sort of written in the South or have certain kinds of elements, but what's your understanding of what that means? What readers expect if they pick up a book and somebody says to them, "This is a Southern Gothic novel"?
Well, it's interesting. I wrote an article on this topic actually recently, and I had to go look up, exactly this. What does Southern Gothic mean to people? And I guess there's certain elements that are, one is that there's sort of a sense of decay and death, that's a part of the story, and that it's, it's sort of hard to describe. It's not quite Tales from the Crypt, but is there's just this sort of this sense that things are, sort of, I don't know, on the darker side of light, I guess, in that, and that there's, that there's certain elements that would, that are uniquely Southern as part of that.
Yeah,
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 maybe that's the, aftermath of the Civil War, sort of the failed Confederacy, all this stuff, I think sort of boils into that whole genre.
yeah. And the tension created in these kinds of novels, it's to me, it's not strictly the character's journey. Something happens to them and they've got to resolve it, but the atmosphere in which it's happening plays a big role. So setting and time and these other factors, these outside forces, sort of play a role, almost a character in and of themselves. Would you say?
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting that, and I intentionally set a large part of the book in North Florida because people, don't really think of or realize that North Florida is very much the South. I mean, this
Yeah.
is not Miami Beach. This is not, this is in Orange Groves. this is, hanging Spanish moss and big oak trees and that sort of thing. But it's very, it's different in certain ways too. I mean, the area where Johnny grows up initially is sort of on the coast in Northwest Florida. And so where I've spent a lot of time myself, it's beautiful. It's, a lot of pine trees, beautiful beaches, but it's very different from what most people think of Florida.
Right. Very true. Very true. So if they read the book, they'll get an education as
Well, yeah,
well.
or just, a sense of a little, I mean, that's one of the great things, like for books that, that I like that, put you in, Where the Crawdads Sing or a lot of Pat Conroy's
Mhm.
books. I mean, you feel like you're there at someplace, who's been to the tidal marshes of South Carolina. I spent a lot of time there. Well, I haven't. So it's interesting to be sort of immersed in it.
Right.
Just like you say, it's sort of it brings the whole book together.
Right. Right. So what do you want readers to think about after they've read the book? Are there messages you want them to pick up on? Are there questions you want them to contemplate for themselves once they've finished the book? I'm curious, as a writer, were there things that you intentionally set out to kind of feed the reader, or were there things that you discovered after it was done? Okay, this is what the reader's probably going to think, feel, perhaps do.
Well, I would if I could go talk about one of my earlier books, and it'll relate back to this. As I mentioned, each of my novels have had some element of the religion in them, and so the first novel was about a black woman who claimed to be Christ returned, and I thought it was I look back on it now and said, wow, that I had no idea what I was doing, but the concept was good. That that what would really happen if that that happened. And so here I tried to extend that a little bit further, right? Well, there's this boy, I mean, he's got these things, they look like wings, what is this? And just the reactions different people would have. And I think they would run the gamut from people saying, oh, this is an angel. This is, to people going, oh, we need to destroy this. This is horrible. And so there's a little bit, I wanted people to think, I mean, Johnny's last name is Cruel. And so, JC, I mean, that's, it may be fairly obvious there, but what if, but is there a cruelty, as part of, as part of our look at religion? I mean, to me, there is to some degree. I mean, yeah, you're in, you're not, sorry, that sort of thing. So I wanted people to think about, that to come away with this going, oh, yeah, that's, in addition to being entertained, I hope, by the story, to sort of think through, yeah, how do we treat people, that are different? I mean, wasn't Jesus different? So that's a long answer to your question.
Well, let's talk about your other books, because this is your third novel
Yes,
that you've had published. So, Boy with Wings, number three.
right,
Your first one, first and second, The Return and The Gendarme.
right.
So let's talk about those. We can take them in whichever order you prefer, but if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about each book, and then I'd like to kind of take the set and discuss what it was like writing each of them and how they differed.
Okay. Well, so The Return, as I mentioned, I wrote, this may have been the product of an early midlife crisis, because I had, I still am a lawyer. And so I'd been a lawyer for about 10 years, and I was driving by myself on I-10 a lot and going, well, there's got to be more than this. And so I decided I wanted to maybe run for public office and maybe teach and maybe try and write a book. And eventually I did all of those. And I taught for a couple of years at the community college here, and that was enough to cure me of that. And I ran for office, and I was elected as a city commissioner for 10 years, and that was enough of that. But I sat down to write this book. I had no idea what I was doing. And so I later saw that was sort of the equivalent of somebody said of waking up one morning and saying, hey, I think I'll go practice thoracic surgery today. So I was very fortunate to get the book published. And I look back on it now, and to some extent I go, well, hey, this is pretty good for what it is. And then in other respects, I go, I hope I've gotten better since then. But I was proud to get it done. And I think that, again, I thought the concept was great. It's still, I think, a very, interesting to be a setup. The gendarme, so my heritage way back is Armenian, and I've never known much about it. And so I just decided one day I was going to sit down and try and, figure this out or learn something. And so I sat down to write the book. And that book took a lot of twists and turns to get published. And at that point, I was trying to find an agent, and I thought I had an agent. He read the book, and the book had a historical part that was about the Armenian genocide, which is what the real topic of the book. And then the other was sort of a current day part. And this guy said, "Well, yeah, the historical part is great, but you need to rewrite the whole current day part." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I spent years on this." But I did. I went back and rewrote the whole thing, changed the point of view for it and everything. And then he said, "Yeah, I just don't love it enough to take it on." But I kept that version, and that's what got published. And I'm very proud of that book. I mean, it's been published in 10 languages now. I spoke all over the world about it. And it was a sort of the unique thing, and I credit this agent who didn't take me on, that to sort of setting it from the point of view of this guy who was near the end of his life, and he had been injured in the war and forgotten a lot of stuff, and suddenly he has some medical issues at the end of his life, and he remembers what happens, and so it's going back for him through this early part of his life. So I think again, it was from a religious standpoint, I did a lot of research about the Armenian genocide. And it was interesting, a lot of people that survived sort of lost their faith in God. So they just could not reconcile a loving God with what happened here. And so, which is a really, difficult religious thing. And so that was that. And then the Boy with Wings, again, it's sort of I just wanted to explore the whole, the what is being different and human oddness, and the people that sort of populated freak shows, ran the gamut from people with various, what we now know are sort of chromosomal deficiencies or differences that cause them to be covered with hair or cause them to be really tall or really short or whatever. And to some extent it's a piece of its time, because those were much more accepted as or not accepted, but you're sort of regular things that people went to see. And now to some extent we've said, oh no, that's really taking advantage of these people. But I can certainly point to things, and I'm sure you can too, of current situations where we demonize people that we, the majority, look at as odd. And so that that's sort of how I got to the Boy with Wings book.
And do you think, just an aside, what do you think the attraction is, or in this case was, to these sort of traveling sideshows with these people who were different on display for others' entertainment? What was the attraction, do you think, to that?
Well, I think it's sort of, this is an overused, example, but it's the whole car crash thing. Hey, we're driving past, well, we don't want to see it, but we got to stop and look. And a little bit of that. I read this whole book that this guy had gone deep into the psychology of people's attraction to freaks. The name of the book was Freaks. And and he got way down rabbit holes of being Freudian, or and one thing I remember he pointed out. He said, well, from your earliest date as a child, you're dealing with giants, because adults, they're giants to you, and so there's all this sort of mental and sexual stuff, and he went into great detail about the different types of human oddities, the hermaphrodites and the really tall people that at that point were really fat people. I mean, it was just sort of how they were treated, and how and why people sort of how they reacted to them differently. There's a whole history of the Greeks, for example, treated certain types of oddities one way and certain another. And the Romans, created the circus. Yeah, this is all great, and then Middle Ages, anything we don't understand, we're putting it at the stake. Yeah. So it's just, throughout history, it's a sort of a I don't know, a differing treatment of people that were just seemed different.
And for the people who were participants in these traveling shows, I'm sure that was an interesting experience because in one respect they are being taken advantage of in a lot of respects, but as you mentioned, they are suddenly the stars being famous, given notoriety for the thing that has made them so different and isolated from everybody else. In your research and everything, what was it like for the people who were in these shows? Did they see it as sort of better or a good thing or an opportunity in some respects?
Well, I found that it varied a lot, and I tried to explore that in the book because, to some extent, these people's lives were better. I mean, before they're hidden in the back room, their families are, trying to, hide them, and suddenly, and a lot of them wouldn't get sold to these shows. They're like family. Oh, we can get rid of them and make some money. Here you go. And there's an interesting book, a nonfiction book that came out probably 10 years ago called True Vine, and it's about some very famous albino African American boys who were sold into one of these shows and became worldwide famous. And they were portrayed as wild creatures from Borneo or whatever. And I sort of took it from that on the one hand they didn't mind it that much, and their mother eventually, who I think sold them, was a little unclear, but then got them back. And when they came back, they weren't super happy being back at home. And so eventually they went out on limited, tours again. And so it's a little bit of, there's that dynamic. I also tried to talk about the sort of rivalry between the people who are, really performing, breathing fire, doing sword swallowing, I mean, 8 to 10 times a day, and the guy who comes out and shows his back once and he's the star, and so it's just sort of it was very interesting to just see all the dynamics and nuances of these shows and people who were in them.
Yeah. Do you think this is your voice, this idea of exploring characters who have this sort of internal conflict in a historical setting? Do you think historical fiction in these terms is something you will continue to write, or will works in progress explore other genres, do you think?
I mean, it's probably some of both. I mean, I have another novel I'm working on now that I'm superstitious about talking about, but it's a historical novel from the point of view of a woman that I just found this amazing historical story. Whether I've done anything with it, I don't know, but her story is just unbelievable. And so I tried to, but she is flawed in certain ways. She can't see stuff, that in hindsight we can all see. And so I've tried to, I don't know, take each of these sort of on their own. And, in the gendarme, a lot of it was, can you do bad things and still be a good person at the end of the day? A Boy with Wings, it's a little bit more, what is it like to be different? What does it mean exactly to be different? And so I'd like to just take different pieces of that whole equation and play with them some. So we'll have to see. I wouldn't rule out doing some current day stuff, but this is just what intrigues me at this point, and it's fun to learn new stuff. I mean, I spent years reading about sideshows. I knew almost nothing about that. So I learned a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Was your approach to each of the books different? Does your approach to writing a book vary based on the subject matter or what's happening in your life at the time, or are you one of those writers who's fairly regimented about how you approach a book, how you approach your research, your drafting, your editing, etc.?
No, they've all been a little bit different. I mean, my writing process is more or less the same. So I write early in the morning. That's what I've done since my kids were little. And at that time, it's the only time I could do this. It was chaos the rest of the day. But I've kept that up, and I've just discovered I like doing it. And I like doing that way because it keeps my head in the book. So if I think about it every day, even when I'm doing other stuff, I'm thinking about it and that sort of thing. But for the return, I had sort of, I'd written part of it and then I plotted out the rest of it pretty, for the rest of the book. For the gendarme, it was more, there was a current part and a historical part, and I sort of went back and forth working on those. And then with Boy with Wings, the way the book is set up, it's primarily a third person from the point of view of Johnny. But then there's first person accounts of people that are sort of reacting to Johnny. And so that was different. And it was, and I played with that a lot because I was, does this work? Let's try it this way, let's try it that way. And it just seemed to fit the best, that to do it the way I did it, because there's something still a little mysterious about Johnny, just like there is about Jesus or God or anything. And so I wanted it to be sort of, this is how people are reacting to him, and you learn about him a lot from what their reactions are.
Interesting. So other than the work in progress you just mentioned that you gave us just a tiny taste of, what other goals do you have for yourself as a writer? Other things you want to try, other things you want to do?
Well, I don't know. I feel like I have, a few more novels in me, and so I'd like to get those published. I have, I think I have pretty good. In fact, I feel like I have really good ideas for these other novels. It's just a matter of writing them. I have another one that's a little bit more of a current day that I haven't written any of it, but I think again, I think it's a great concept. I just need to figure out how the characters, drive the concept. And so that's because I want it to be, the best books are the characters, drive everything. It's not the plot. And so I have three characters in my mind. One, I know exactly what I want to do. Two, I've got a pretty good idea. Last one, I don't feel like I have well enough.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, in the meantime, if people want to learn more about you and your books, look for new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you and that information?
Well, you can go to my website, which is markmustian.com. And I'm also the founder and the current president of the Word of South Festival of Literature and Music in Tallahassee. That we now in our 11th year of combining authors and musicians in all sorts of different ways. And so you can find me on the Word of South website as also. And that's coming up in April. We've got great authors, great musicians. I thought I would do this for about 5 years and move on, but I'm still there working on it. But I'm very proud of it. There's one of the best things or most rewarding things people tell me about it is just they said, we've never been to anything like this before, and so it really is. There's nothing like it in the country. So I hope people will come check it out if they haven't been.
Good. Good. Excellent. And if people want to purchase a copy of Boy with Wings or your other two books, where can they go to buy them?
They can order through my website, and there's links to Bookshop and to other outlets there. Also, if you want to get a signed book, the Midtown Reader bookstore, the independent bookstore in Tallahassee, is helping with that. So there's a couple of ways to get books that you can access through the website.
Wonderful. Well, Mark, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with Boy with Wings and your work in progress. We'll look forward to that. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thanks, Stacy.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.